My name is James Vincent. I am 70 years old, and for 40 years I welded, wired, and eventually managed production lines at Franklin Industrial Systems, a manufacturing plant on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. The day the company decided to celebrate those 40 years was supposed to be one of the proudest afternoons of my life. Instead, it became the day I finally admitted my son had stopped seeing me as his father. The ballroom at the downtown Columbus Convention Center held nearly 400 people that afternoon. Round tables draped in white linen stretched from the stage to the back wall. Cameras from the local news affiliate stood on tripods near the exits, their operators adjusting lenses while executives in tailored suits shook hands and laughed under chandeliers that threw soft gold light across the room. The master of ceremonies, a sharp young woman named Teresa Vance from corporate communications, stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone twice. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a man whose integrity has shaped this company for 4 decades. The screen behind her lit up with photographs pulled from 4 decades of my life. There I was in 1986, 26 years old, grinning under an oversized hard hat that didn't fit right. There I was at company picnics with coworkers who had long since passed away or retired to Florida. There I was, standing quietly in the back of 100 other people's celebrations, applauding retirements, promotions, and anniversaries that were never mine. Today, for the first time, it was supposed to be my turn. Applause rippled through the ballroom. I smiled, nodded, and tried to look like a man enjoying his moment. But my eyes kept drifting to the front row, to a single reserved chair with a small white card resting on the seat. Ryan Vincent, it read. My only son. The chair stayed empty. The camera operator near the stage noticed where I kept looking. He tilted his lens toward the empty seat, and the giant screen above the stage showed it to the entire room. 400 people followed my gaze at once. Nobody had to say anything. Everyone understood exactly what they were looking at. Teresa lowered the microphone and crossed the stage toward me, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. Mr. Vincent, would you like us to wait a few more minutes? I shook my head. No, would you like someone else to sit beside you? I scanned the ballroom. Near the back, half hidden behind a pillar, stood a young man in a navy suit that had clearly been pressed with more care than money. His hands were folded in front of him like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there at all. I recognized him instantly. Daniel. I looked straight at him. His eyes went wide, like he hadn't expected me to notice him, let alone call his name in front of hundreds of strangers. I raised my voice so the whole room could hear. Would you come sit with me? Daniel looked almost frightened. He pointed at his own chest. Me? I nodded. Your father would have been sitting there if he were still alive. The ballroom went completely silent. Daniel walked down that long aisle like every step cost him something, his shoes echoing against the marble. When he reached the front row, he lowered himself into the chair that had my son's name still sitting on it, and I reached over and patted his shoulder. I kept my voice low. Thanks for coming. His voice barely made it out. I wouldn't have missed this. 5 minutes later, the CEO, Richard Thompson, returned to the podium with a folder tucked under his arm. He looked at me, then at Daniel, and smiled in a way that told me something was about to happen that I hadn't been warned about. Richard leaned toward the microphone. There is one final surprise. I frowned. Nobody had told me about a surprise. Richard continued. Years ago, James Vincent quietly turned down several executive bonuses. Instead, he asked the company to create a legacy fund honoring loyalty, sacrifice, and service to others. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wind through wheat. Today, Richard said, that fund officially begins. And the first recipient was personally selected by James himself. Daniel looked at me, confusion written across his face. I hadn't told him anything either, because until that moment, I hadn't been entirely sure the company would actually go through with what I'd asked for years earlier. Richard smiled at Daniel. Daniel Brooks will receive an $800,000 legacy gift. The ballroom exploded. People stood. Some cheered, some cried, and a few simply stared in disbelief. Daniel froze in his chair like the words hadn't reached him yet. I think there's been a mistake, he stammered. Richard laughed softly into the microphone. There hasn't. Daniel covered his face with both hands. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder the way I used to squeeze his father's shoulder, decades ago. On job sites neither of us could have afforded to dream past. You earned this, I told him. 3 hours later, I sat alone in my pickup truck outside my small ranch house on the edge of town, the porch light flickering the way it had for the last 2 years, since I kept forgetting to replace the bulb. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. Then it buzzed again. And again. When I finally looked, the screen showed 47 missed calls. Most were from Ryan. The rest were from his wife Wendy, a scattering of unknown numbers, a few distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, and, unbelievably, 2 reporters. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned it face down on the seat beside me, because the story everyone had just watched unfold on live television had actually begun 6 years earlier. In a kitchen that smelled like coffee and grief, on a night nobody was filming. Until 6 years ago, I never imagined my family would drift apart the way it did. My late wife Linda and I had built a simple life together. Nothing glamorous, nothing anyone would envy from a distance. Just honest work, cookouts in the backyard, camping trips every summer, pizza on Friday nights, and church on Sunday mornings. Ryan grew up in a modest brick house believing we weren't wealthy. The truth was simpler than that. Linda and I had always believed money should buy security, not attention. Linda passed away after a brief and difficult illness. Ryan was 31 at the time, already married, already building a life of his own. Her death changed something inside both of us. For me, it created a silence I never quite learned to fill. For Ryan, it created distance. At first I told myself that was normal. People get busy. Careers demand more. Marriages require attention. Life moves forward whether we're ready or not. I understood that. I truly did. I never expected weekly visits or holiday dinners every month. I only hoped we'd still be father and son in the ways that mattered. Instead, our conversations slowly became appointments. Dad, can I call you later? Dad, we're busy this weekend. Dad, maybe next month. Months became seasons. Seasons became years. Whenever Ryan did visit, his wife Wendy always seemed eager to leave. She wasn't openly rude about it. She simply carried herself like spending time with me was one more obligation squeezed between vacations, brunches, and social commitments that mattered more. I never blamed her entirely. Marriage changes priorities. But somewhere along the way, my son had stopped making decisions for himself. If Wendy wanted something, that became Ryan's opinion too. I noticed it in the small things. He stopped fishing with me, stopped coming over to watch football on Sundays, stopped calling to ask my advice about anything at all. Even birthdays became text messages with a cake emoji attached. Still, I never complained. Parents don't keep score. At least, good parents try not to. There was a stretch, about 2 years after Linda passed, when I genuinely believed things might turn around. Ryan had taken a new position at an insurance firm downtown, and for a few months he called me nearly every week to talk through decisions he was making, the way he used to when he was younger and still trusted my opinion on things that mattered. I remember sitting on my back porch one evening, phone pressed to my ear, listening to him describe a promotion he was chasing. Feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. I let myself believe the distance had only been grief working itself out of both of us in different ways. Then Wendy's career took off. She moved into a director role at a marketing firm, and their social calendar filled up with the kind of events that photographed well and left very little room for anything that didn't. I don't say that to blame her for all of it. I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, and the honest truth is that Ryan let it happen. He could have carved out a Sunday afternoon. He could have picked up the phone on a random Tuesday evening just to talk about nothing in particular. He chose not to, again and again. In small enough increments that neither of us ever had to name what was happening out loud. I kept myself busy at the plant. 40 years is a long time to spend somewhere, and toward the end of my career, younger employees started calling me sir without meaning anything by it, the way you'd address a fixture of the building rather than a person. I trained 3 generations of line supervisors. I sat on the safety committee for over a decade. I mentored more young engineers than I could name off the top of my head, and more than a few of them still send me a Christmas card every December, longer than my own son manages some years. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being valued everywhere, except at your own kitchen table. And I carried that quietly for longer than I probably should have. Then, about 3 months before my retirement ceremony, the company announced something I hadn't expected. The board wanted to celebrate employees who had given 40 consecutive years of service. Only 2 people in the company's history qualified. One had already retired quietly overseas. That left me. The communications department wanted interviews, old photographs, and full television coverage because Franklin Industrial Systems had grown into one of Ohio's largest manufacturing employers, and this was going to be a public celebration, not a quiet retirement dinner. Honestly, I would have been perfectly content with a handshake and a sheet cake in the break room. But Richard insisted. "You've spent 40 years taking care of this company," he told me over the phone. "Now let us take care of you." A week later, I drove out to Ryan's house to deliver the invitation myself. He answered the door in golf clothes, and behind him, Wendy was loading suitcases into their SUV. "You heading somewhere?" "Weekend in Tennessee," Ryan said. I handed him the invitation. He opened it, and his eyebrows rose. "They're televising this?" "That's pretty cool, Dad." He looked over his shoulder at Wendy, then back at me. "I'd really like to be there." "Of course I'll be there." He pulled me into a hug. I wouldn't miss it. I believed him. Every word. Because no matter how old your child becomes, part of you always believes the promises they make. I had no idea that only 24 hours before the ceremony, my phone would ring, Ryan's name would light up the screen, and one short conversation would change the shape of everything I thought I understood about my family. Ryan's name sat on my screen for several seconds before I finally answered. Somewhere underneath the hope, I already knew something was wrong. Or maybe I should say something had finally become impossible to ignore. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful, the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. "Everything okay?" "Yeah. Listen, Wendy found this incredible last-minute deal. A resort out in Scottsdale. 5 stars. We leave tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. The morning of my ceremony. I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the maple tree Linda and I had planted 25 years earlier, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. In the background I heard Wendy's voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Babe, tell him they'll understand." Ryan lowered his voice like that would soften it. "Dad, we've both been working so hard. Wendy really needs this vacation." I smiled, though nobody could see it. "I understand. Really, I do. We'll celebrate next week. I'll take you out somewhere nice." "That sounds fine." I let the words sit there, flat and small. "You aren't upset?" "No, really. I'm 70 years old, Ryan," I added, mostly to myself. "I guess you've learned not to sweat the small stuff." He laughed, relieved. If only he'd known what I already understood, sitting alone in that kitchen with the porch light flickering outside. This wasn't small. It never had been. It was simply the moment the truth finally stopped hiding. If a story like this one has ever made you think of your own family, of a parent who gave everything quietly and asked for nothing in return, I want you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment below and tell me who came to mind. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge. I hung up the phone that night and stood in my kitchen for a long time without moving. The house felt bigger than it had in years, the kind of silence that settles into the corners of a home once the people who used to fill it have gone their separate ways. I thought about calling someone. There wasn't really anyone left to call. My brother had passed years earlier. Most of my old coworkers had scattered across the state, chasing grandchildren and warmer winters. And then I thought of Michael. Michael Brooks had been my closest friend since we were both 23 years old, working the same production line at Franklin Industrial Systems, back when the plant still had a single water fountain and a foreman who yelled more than he needed to. Michael and I raised our families 2 streets apart. Our sons, Ryan and Daniel, grew up trading baseball cards on the same front porch. When Michael's wife left when Daniel was only 6, Michael raised that boy alone, and I helped where I could, the way you help a brother. Michael died 15 years ago in a workplace accident that the company took full responsibility for, and quietly. Without ever making it public, set aside a portion of my own bonus checks over the following years to help cover Daniel's tuition. I never told Daniel where that money came from. Michael would have done the same for Ryan without blinking, and some debts you don't repay so people can thank you. You repay them so the ledger stays honest in your own chest. I thought about Daniel that night, now 32 years old, teaching robotics and shop class at a public high school on the east side of the city, driving a car with over 180,000 miles on it. Every year on the anniversary of Michael's death, he still stopped by my house on his way home from the cemetery, just to sit on the porch for a few minutes and let me know he'd gone. Not because I asked him to. Because that was who he was. I remembered the summer Daniel turned 16, not long after Michael died, when the boy showed up at my garage uninvited, asking if I had any odd jobs he could help with on weekends. I didn't need the help. I gave him work anyway, sweeping floors that were already clean, organizing toolboxes that didn't need organizing. Because I understood even then that a boy who just lost his father needs somewhere to put his hands and his attention that isn't grief. He never once asked me for money. He asked me questions about engines, about wiring, about how things worked. The same restless curiosity his father used to have on the production line back when we were both too young to know how hard the years ahead would be. I watched him grow into exactly the kind of man Michael would have raised, patient with people, generous with credit, allergic to attention. When I first proposed the legacy fund to the board years earlier, I hadn't attached Daniel's name to it. I only asked that whatever it became, it should go towards someone who had given more than they'd received and never once asked for recognition. Richard had pressed me at the time to name a department or program up front, something easy to market. I told him I already knew exactly the kind of person it needed to find, and that when the time came, I would know. The next morning, I called Teresa in communications and asked if it would be possible to reserve one additional seat near the front row, just in case. She didn't ask why. She simply said it would be done. What I didn't know at the time was that Teresa had also passed my selection along to the legal and finance departments, the way company policy required for anything involving a payout of that size. Someone from HR had called Daniel a few days before the ceremony, telling him only that the company wanted to verify some information for a community recognition honor tied to a former employee, and asking him to sign a short release form and confirm his banking details for tax purposes. Daniel told me later he'd assumed it was something small, maybe a plaque or a certificate for a former student's scholarship essay, and hadn't thought much of it since. Nobody at the company told him the amount. Nobody told him it was connected to me. As far as Daniel knew, walking into that ballroom, he was simply there to support the father of a friend. I never told Daniel to come. I only mentioned, almost in passing during a phone call 2 days earlier, that the ceremony was open to the public and that his father would have been proud of the moment. Daniel showed up anyway, in a suit he'd clearly pressed himself, standing at the back of a ballroom full of people he didn't know, because that was who he was. By the time the ceremony ended and I sat alone in my truck staring at 47 missed calls, Ryan and Wendy were already boarding a return flight out of Phoenix. They had turned on the airport television at their gate, expecting to catch a few minutes of local news before their flight, and instead watched their own family's story unfold live in front of a room full of strangers. The calls kept coming, one after another, all the way through their layover and their landing back in Columbus. I let every one of them ring out. It wasn't spite. I simply didn't have anything to say yet that wouldn't come out sharper than I intended. It was only later, sitting at my kitchen table, that Ryan told me he'd called from the gate before they boarded, and again the moment he landed. Standing at baggage claim with his phone pressed to his ear, watching it ring and ring into nothing. They showed up at my house the following evening. I heard Ryan's car in the driveway before I heard the knock. When I opened the door, Ryan stood there, in the same shirt he'd worn on the flight, his eyes red-rimmed, Wendy a step behind him with her arms crossed. "Dad." Ryan's eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Can we talk? I stepped aside and let them in. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Linda used to grade the church bulletin every Sunday afternoon. Wendy remained standing near the doorway, like she hadn't decided whether she was staying. I saw the video, Ryan said. Everyone's seen the video. It's everywhere. I didn't do it for attention. I know that. He rubbed both hands over his face. That's what makes it worse. Silence sat between us for a moment. You gave him $800,000, Ryan said, and there was something underneath his voice I hadn't expected. Not quite anger. Something closer to shame trying to disguise itself as confusion. That money could have. Could have what? I pressed. Gone to you? He didn't answer. That fund was never about you or Daniel, I told him. It was about a promise I made your mother before she died, that if this company ever recognized what I gave it, I'd use whatever came from it to lift someone up who actually needed it. You've never needed it, Ryan. You have a good job, a good house, a wife who wants for nothing. Daniel has been driving the same car for a decade, so his students could have new equipment. Wendy finally spoke from the doorway, her voice tight. So now everyone gets to act like Ryan is some terrible son. Nobody answered her. Wendy grabbed her purse off the counter. I'm not sitting here listening to this guilt trip. Ryan looked up at her. You should go. She blinked. What? You heard me. His voice was quiet, but steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. I need to stay. For him. For me. She stared at him for several long seconds, waiting for him to take it back. He didn't. She turned and walked out the front door, and the slam echoed through the house long after the sound itself had stopped. Ryan didn't follow her. Instead, he slowly turned back toward me, and for the first time in years, he wasn't looking at me the way you look at an obligation. He was looking at me the way a son looks at his father. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, the way he'd done since he was a boy caught somewhere he shouldn't be. Wendy thinks you're punishing us. Making a point. Is that what you think? I don't know what to think anymore. His voice cracked slightly. I keep replaying it. Standing at that airport gate, watching you on the screen, watching Daniel's face when they said the number, and all I could think was, that should have been me sitting there. Not the money. Just sitting there. Next to you. You were invited. I know. Nobody made you choose Scottsdale. I know that too. He looked up at me, and for a second I saw the boy who used to wait on the porch steps for me to come home from double shifts. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you plan it? Inviting Daniel. Did you know this would happen? I shook my head slowly. I didn't know about the money until Richard said it out loud, same as you. I invited Daniel because his chair was empty too, in a different way. His father should have been alive to see me get that award. Yours should have been alive to see his own father stand next to me. Neither one of you got that. I just decided one empty seat didn't have to stay empty. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. That's a better answer than if you'd planned it. Why's that? Because it means you weren't trying to teach me a lesson. You were just being who you've always been. He exhaled hard. And I still missed it. A knock came at the door 20 minutes later. It was Daniel, carrying 2 paper bags that smelled like fresh bread and something simmering underneath it. He hesitated when he saw Ryan sitting at the table. I can come back, Daniel said. No, I told him. Stay. Daniel set the bags on the counter. Homemade soup, a loaf of bread from the bakery a few blocks from his apartment, and an apple pie that looked almost exactly like the ones Linda used to bake every October. Daniel shrugged. I figured today was too important for takeout. Ryan watched him unpack the food in silence, something shifting behind his eyes. You've been taking care of my dad, Ryan said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like gratitude that hadn't found its shape yet. Daniel looked embarrassed. He took care of me first. For the first few minutes at that table, nobody said much of anything. Sometimes people imagine that reconciliation happens because someone delivers the perfect speech. Life rarely works that way. More often, healing begins over something as ordinary as sharing a meal with the people you almost lost. Ryan finally broke the silence, staring down at the wooden table. I honestly don't remember the last time we had dinner together. Just the two of us. It was Thanksgiving. He frowned. No, that was 3 years ago. I know. His face fell. I thought it had only been a year. Time moves faster than we realize. The words sat over the table longer than anything else spoken that night. If you've ever had a moment where you realized more time had passed than you were willing to admit, I want you to sit with that for a second. And if this story is speaking to something in your own life right now, comment the word home below and subscribe now. The week after Wendy left, Ryan called me every morning. Not to ask for anything, not to explain himself, simply to ask, "How are you today, Dad?" At first I wondered whether it was guilt talking. Guilt usually gets tired eventually. Consistency doesn't. Monday became Wednesday. Wednesday became Friday. The calls kept coming. One afternoon he showed up carrying 2 fishing rods, both a little dusty, the reels stiff from disuse. He held one out toward me. "Found these in my garage." I recognized it immediately. It had been mine, a gift from Linda nearly 30 years earlier. I thought maybe, if you're free Saturday. "I've been free for years," I told him. His eyes watered. That Saturday, we drove out to Alum Creek, the same stretch of water where I'd taught him to cast a line when he was 8 years old. The old wooden dock still leaned slightly to one side. The paint faded down to bare gray wood in places, though the benches had been replaced sometime in the last decade. Everything else felt exactly the way I remembered it. Ryan cast his line into the still water. I forgot how quiet it is out here. That's why I like it. He watched the ripples spread across the surface. I used to think success meant the biggest house, the nicest vacations, the newest car. He let out a short laugh, more at himself than anything else. I spent so much time chasing things that I forgot to make time for people. I didn't interrupt. He needed to hear himself say it out loud. He looked over at me. "My whole life, you showed up. And somewhere along the way, I stopped showing up for you. Yes, I'm ashamed of that. I know. You aren't making this easy." I smiled at him gently. "Forgiveness isn't the hard part, Ryan. Trust is. How do I earn that back?" "The same way you lost it. One Sunday at a time." He nodded and accepted that without arguing. And something about the way he accepted it, without defending himself, without explaining it away, told me he was actually changing. "Can I ask you something else?" he said, reeling his line in slowly. "You can ask. Were you angry? All those years. When I kept canceling, kept putting you off." I thought about it honestly before I answered. Angry isn't quite the word. Angry burns hot, and then it's gone. This was quieter than that. More like waiting in a room for somebody who kept saying they were 5 minutes away. He winced. "That's worse than angry." "Maybe. But you're here now." "I am." "Then that's the part that matters." Meanwhile, Daniel's life had transformed almost overnight. Local news stations kept following the story of what the company now called the Legacy Gratitude Fund. Parents wrote him letters thanking him for believing in their kids when nobody else had. Former students posted messages online describing how his classroom had convinced them to pursue engineering instead of giving up on themselves. Instead of disappearing from public attention, Daniel used it. He announced that nearly half of the gift would go toward establishing scholarships for students interested in robotics and skilled trades. The kind of programs that rarely get funded because they don't photograph as well as football stadiums. "I wouldn't be standing here," he told a reporter during one interview, "if someone hadn't believed in me long before I believed in myself." He never mentioned my name unless someone asked directly. That was typical of him. He always redirected the praise towards someone else. A month later, he invited Ryan and me to visit his classroom. Teenagers crowded around half-built robots, humming computer towers, and workbenches scattered with tools. One girl, maybe 16 years old, walked up to me shyly, twisting a wrench in her hands. "Mr. Brooks says you're the reason we got the new equipment." I laughed and pointed across the room toward Daniel. "No, he's the reason." She smiled. "He says you taught him generosity." Daniel overheard that from across the room. He looked at me over the heads of a dozen students, and neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. Michael would have understood exactly what passed between us in that silence. Ryan started coming to the house every Sunday after that. Sometimes we watched football. Sometimes we worked in the yard. Sometimes we simply sat on the back porch and drank coffee until the sun went down. He never acted like one apology had erased years of distance. Instead, he did something much harder than an apology. He kept showing up, week after week, without being asked. One afternoon he arrived with a small toolbox. "What are we fixing?" "The fence." "It isn't broken." He smiled. "I know. I just wanted an excuse to spend the day with you." I laughed harder than I had in months. "You finally sound like my son again." Somewhere in those months, Ryan started asking me things he hadn't asked since he was a teenager. "How did you and Mom stay married for 38 years? How did you know when to push and when to let something go?" I didn't have tidy answers for him. Marriage isn't a set of instructions you follow in order. But I told him what I could. About the nights Linda and I sat up arguing about money we didn't have. About the years we barely recognized each other underneath the exhaustion of raising a kid on 2 working-class incomes. About the choice, made over and over, to stay curious about each other instead of settling into 2 people who simply lived under the same roof. He listened in a way he never had before, taking a kind of notes that had nothing to do with paper. Wendy never came back. She and Ryan separated quietly a few weeks later, without a courtroom battle, without screaming matches, without either of them trying to win anything from the other. 2 people simply realized they wanted different lives, and for once, Ryan didn't try to blame anyone else for it. "I don't blame Wendy," he admitted to me one evening on the porch. "I made my own choices. I kept choosing convenience. I kept assuming you'd always understand, always wait." I looked at him. "You confused my patience with permission." He nodded slowly, like that sentence had settled something he'd been circling for weeks. It may have been the wisest thing I ever heard him say. Several months after the ceremony, Franklin Industrial Systems invited me back for the dedication of what they were now calling the Legacy Gratitude Mentorship Program, an expansion of the original fund that would pair experienced employees with young people entering skilled trades and engineering careers across the state. Richard stood at the podium and welcomed the crowd. This all began because one man believed character should outlive a paycheck. This time, when I walked into the auditorium, the front row seat beside mine wasn't empty. Ryan was already sitting there, and he stood up as soon as he saw me coming. "I wanted to make sure I got here early." "You certainly did." I wasn't going to miss this one. Not for anything. Daniel sat down on my other side a moment later, dressed in the same navy suit he'd worn to the first ceremony, the one that still fit a little loose in the shoulders. I looked at the 2 young men beside me, one connected to me by blood, the other connected by a promise made between 2 friends, decades earlier on a factory floor that no longer exists. And I realized something in that moment I hadn't fully understood before. Family isn't weakened by gratitude, it's strengthened by it. I thought about Linda a great deal that day, sitting between the 2 of them. She would have liked Daniel enormously, the way she liked anyone who showed up quietly and did the work without needing to be asked twice. I think she would have told me I waited too long to let Ryan see how much his absence had cost me, and she probably would have been right. But I've also learned at 70 years old that most of us don't get to choose the shape our regrets take. We only get to choose what we do once we notice them. The ceremony itself wasn't nearly as emotional as the first one had been. There were no surprise gifts, no television cameras waiting to capture an empty chair, no shocking announcements over a microphone. Just dozens of young apprentices meeting mentors who genuinely cared whether they succeeded. And honestly, that mattered more than any headline ever could have. As we walked toward the parking lot afterward, Ryan stopped beside my truck, his hand resting on the tailgate the way it used to when he was a teenager, waiting for me to finish a job before we drove home together. "Dad." "Yes." "Thank you." "For what?" "For loving me. Even when I made it hard." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Being your father was never the hard part, Ryan. The hard part was waiting for you to find your way home." He wrapped his arms around me, the kind of hug that lasts long enough to say everything words never quite managed to say on their own. For the first time in years, I felt my family becoming whole again. Not because money had changed anyone. Money never repairs a single relationship on its own. Choices repaired it. Time repaired it. Humility repaired it. And love, the quiet, stubborn kind that refuses to disappear no matter how long it's ignored, had finally been met with gratitude on both sides. If this story reminded you of someone who has sacrificed quietly for your family, don't wait for a special occasion to tell them what they mean to you. Time is the one gift none of us ever get to earn back. And if this journey touched your heart the way it touched mine to tell it, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who needs the reminder today. Subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge for more stories about family, second chances, and the quiet strength it takes to choose love over pride.